All right, Zig coming in on the top. Today on the show, we have Jared Michael Nickerson, bass player extraordinaire. Jared has played with an absurd amount of projects. I'm going to name a few. Human Switchboard, JJ Jumpers, Black Rock Coalition. He has also played with The Roots, Mark Anthony Thompson, DJ Logic, Bernie Worrell, Freedy Johnston. The list goes on. This is just a few. But we're here to talk to him about his work with the Burnt Sugar Arkestra Chamber, spelled ARK, as a nod to Sun Ra. We get into it, which is an absurdly cool group. Unjustly summed up right quick. It's an improv orchestra that is conducted. Now, I dove into all the records before our conversation, and right before I started to get into some of their live performances, where they'll take a piece like they did Shaft, and they perform it live but improved. There's a really cool video on YouTube. You got to check it out. Burnt Sugar's new album is Angel Over Wakanda. It's available on all streaming platforms. And on September 23rd, John Coltrane's birthday, and there will be a standalone edition with outtakes and other bonus features available on Bandcamp. You can also order a physical copy at the following locations, or following record stores: Downtown Music Gallery, New York City; Dusty Groove, Chicago; Amoeba Records; and Landlock Music. Those are locations where you can order a physical copy from. It's important to support the record stores while we still got them, especially during these times. We're going to listen to a track off of Wakanda. Here is Isla Ova in a Wakanda.
Angels over Wakanda. You're slipping away from my sympathy. Fast being erased from any empathy. Taking my blues back and all my unruly symphonies. Maroon terrain, subject to pain. Maroon terrain, a whole new world to gain. Angels over Wakanda. We tend the flames, recalling all the names, in wonder as we wander, in wonder as we wander these ruins, healing what's been torn asunder. The angels of Wakanda, avengers of the terrors and the plunder. Angels of Wakanda, the true panther mothers, the true panther, the true panther mothers, the true panther mothers, the true panther mothers. Angels of Wakanda, Wakanda,
Isla Ova in a Wakanda, off of Angels Over Wakanda. Jarrett is a wealth of knowledge. This conversation was greatly appreciated, and we're going to hear that 1 second. If you guys can like, rate, review, subscribe to the podcast on all the podcast platforms, and maybe give us a follow on the social media, such as the Instagram and the Twitter at Zig At The Gig. It helps me keep talking to inspiring people and sharing those insights with you. And without further ado, Jared Michael Nickerson. So let's jump into it. When did you start slapping on the piano?
I was raised on piano. Actually, my family, my aunt and my mother, they both played violin because my grandfather and sister, they played something. And my mother, I wanted to be a drummer to begin.
Yeah.
But my mother said I needed to have some harmonic theory as my foundation. So she started me off on piano. And I took 7 years of piano. And then in high school, I played flute and was also in the percussion section in the concert band and played drums in the marching band my senior year.
Wow. So you got a rounded jump into music.
Yeah, it's funny. I was able to get like sort of like a harmonic foundation and a rhythmic foundation before I even touched bass.
And that's kind of like the blending of both worlds. So
Which is what bass is.
Yeah.
It connects both worlds.
Beautiful. Growing up with a musical family like that, was it competitive, or was everyone just like supportive as far as like oh, that's not right, or you're almost there, that type of deal?
Oh, no. Music in my family, it wasn't put on a pedestal to become competitive. It was basically just sort of like more of a rounding out tool, being able to open up, everybody's senses to another art form. And so basically, whatever I played, they were always very, very supportive. I mean, growing up in the being a child of the '60s, basically, it wasn't strange. First of all, we were raised on AM radio. FM radio really didn't even exist back then. And AM radio was pretty much open formatted. So it wasn't strange for you to hear the Four Tops, Sugar Pie Honey Bunch, and then the next thing you hear is Jefferson Airplane, Somebody to Love. So it was pretty a blessed time, actually, to be exposed to music as a youngster. So we were big Beatles fans, actually, growing up. And I remember my aunt allowed us to throw our first concert in her basement. And we actually put a drum set together. We sort of duct taped a drum set together out of boxes, and using different size boxes to get the different timbres and everything, and played acoustic guitar and did some Beatle covers and stuff, and they all came down, and I can't even imagine how horrible it must have sounded, but they loved us for it, and so it was always very supportive, Dave, in our family.
That's beautiful. Do you remember what Beatles songs you did?
I cannot.
That's awesome. Wow. That's so. It was other forms of art really what's the word I'm looking for? Encouraged as well.
Well, I didn't really drift too far away from music.
Okay.
Like I was never interested in becoming an artist or sketching, or I mean, everybody as a kid you doodle, you make little crazy things, but never thought of it as becoming a lifelong obsession or goal or profession, anything like that. It was pretty much music for me.
What was the moment that made that clear? That was like, this is going to be my form of expression.
It wasn't a moment. I'll just say it was sort of like a cascade of events that, first of all, we all love to dance. And, I was always learning the latest dances from my mom and my mom's friends, the hitchhike, the Camel Walk, the Funky Broadway, all of those. And of course, you're dancing to Motown and all that. So music has just always been a part of my household and my upbringing. So it just sort of morphed into. I had a guitar and noticed that I was really wasn't interested in playing chords. Was really just interested in playing single notes with my thumb, in fact, which I still play with basically predominantly today.
Yeah.
And eventually I just said, like, well, would you get me a bass? And so there's a very, very, it might be, it's famous for where it is in Dayton, Ohio. And Dave, just to let you know, I was born in Cleveland, actually.
Nice.
And went to St. Cecilia grade school before my mom moved to Dayton because she picked up a job at the Veterans Administration as a radioisotope chemist.
Wow.
So we moved to Dayton, and there's a music store by the name of Howard's, which was run by the Howard family. And they were kind of legendary in supporting high school music programs in the area. And I know it's sort of like a dinosaur and not even a topic of conversation these days. But back in the 60s, music departments in high schools were thriving and were very integral to like your basic form of education. And so I was able to go to Howard. My first bass was a harmony bass. And then from harmony, I believe my second bass, I started to go to Fenders. Had a Fender Precision, then a Fender Jazz. And I also even had the bass of my dreams back then was Ampeg put out a bass that had a scroll on top, like as if it was a classical instrument, like an acoustic bass. Yeah. And it was semi-acoustic because it had a hollow body. And right when I finally had saved enough money to buy one of those, they stopped making them and replaced it with the Dan Armstrong plexiglass bass. And so I was able to get one of those. And those were really strange creatures because they had like a pickup that was sort of like, it looked like it was baked because it had like an Adobe outer cover. And mine cracked. And Howard Music was so connected to its customers that they actually contacted Mr. Armstrong in England. And he sent another pickup that basically they were able to insert in the bass, but it didn't have a transistor, so the cable that from the bass to the amp had a transformer or whatever as part of the cable, and then I was able to play using that. But that's just to show you how hands-on, Howard was with its customers.
Yeah, that's important. Shops like that, and I imagine they would also have the lessons, and like.
Oh yeah.
Right. So like it's not just like the Walmart of guitars we have now, but actually carrying and like making that scene, and Dayton had a huge funk scene. That as far as a place to get a bass, that would be it.
Yeah, it was pretty wonderful growing up and all that.
Did you get to hang with those guys, like Ohio players and like Zapp, and did you cross paths early on? Because I know your career kind of took you to Boston, right?
It took me actually to South Bend, Indiana, and then to Boston.
Oh, okay.
And what happened was all of that. First of all, the whole Dayton funk scene had 3 to 4 different elements that made that as to why it became so vibrant. And the first one was the fact of the vibrancy of the high school music music teaching, the teachers in high school, the music teachers
Yeah.
in high school. And the second one was that back in those days, Dayton, for the small town it was, had 3 or 4 different types of industry. There were the car companies, there was National Cash Register, there was Inland Steel, there were a few other manufacturing arms, and there was Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. So you had 2 household families that we're talking about, like, back in the, we're now in the 70s. We're talking, the late 60s, because I left Dayton in 71 for college. So you're talking about in the late 60s through the 70s of having 2 household families that were pulling in a nice piece of change, and everybody lived in homes. So what they did, most of them tricked out their basements into making them sort of like entertainment dens, and we would just go from parents' den to den and jam. And basically, it was fine with the parents because at least they knew where we were and what we were doing.
Right.
So you combine, and then you combine the fact that all these high schools had talent shows. So they had like 3 or 4 talent shows a year, and folks would get together little bands just to compete in the talent shows and be very serious about it. I mean, come in with outfits and we were raised on James Brown because James Brown came through 4 times a year to Dayton. So everybody would have like their little review where they maybe have 3 girls who would be like a come out and do some sweet inspirations, and then you'd have your James Brown impersonator, or there'd be 4 or 5 fellows who would like sort of mimic Temptation tunes and things of that nature, and everybody would have steps and the whole nine. I mean, it was pretty involved. So all that was sort of like the birthing ground for the funk scene. And what it meant was you didn't have to, as a youngster, you didn't have to sneak into clubs or anything. You could play, 12 or 14 times a year just at the talent shows. And that's not even, and that's not even talking about how a lot of these kids also played in church. So you put that all together, and that's where, and being a small town too, that's where basically, the whole funk thing sort of like, can I say it's
Blossomed almost?
Blossomed is a good word. The whole funk thing blossomed because, the Ohio Players played my Halloween high school dance.
No way.
So they were like a local band.
Yeah.
And it wasn't just them. There was the Ohio Players, there were the Majestics, there were the Imperials, there was a band by the name of Overnight Low. And Overnight Low is very important in that whole conversation because the drummer and guitar player in Overnight Low were Chet Willis and Diamond Williams. And those were actually the two. They changed rhythm sections. The Ohio Players put out a number of albums on Westbound Records, Pain and Pleasure and things of those natures.
Right.
And those were basically led by Junie Morris. And at some point, I'm not sure, I was a youngster, so I don't know exactly what went on. But they changed, Junie left, and they changed rhythm sections. Greg Webster, who was in the Ohio Players, went to the Overnight Low, and Diamond came into the Ohio Players, and Chet Willis came over too. And that was the band that did the first Mercury record, Skin Tight. And of course, when Skin Tight came out, that's when they became international stars.
Right.
All that amongst, just the sort of like, the sort of just local musician base of Dayton, that kind of, kind of intermixing that sort of like developed. And then, of course, after the Ohio Players hit, and you see like these guys, driving around a small town in Lamborghinis and Ferraris and stuff like that, other musicians were like, hey.
They got the right idea.
Yeah, we want to do that too. So then you had bands like Zapp, more bounce to the ounce, Roger Troutman. Now let's talk about Roger Troutman. Roger Troutman's family basically had a home refurbishing company, and because of that, they were fairly wealthy. And so Roger, when he first started playing out, his band was actually called Roger and the Human Body Band, and he was like a Hendrix impersonator. And then he and as that, since they were kind of wealthy, they always Roger and his family, and he used his family members in the band would always have like the latest equipment. So they'd be playing an outdoor shed, and they'd have like the custom amps that had the colored vinyl, and they'd have all kinds, just everything that you would think that only pro groups would have. So Roger was raised in that kind of environment. And then, of course, then he becomes, Roger Troutman and starts to record nationally. And you have Slave, which was they went from a high school stage to being produced, the album coming out, and next thing you know, they're going around the country as high school students, opening up for the Commodores.
Jeez, so cool.
So it was pretty amazing.
Yeah. What about Lakeside or Heatwave? You ever crossed paths with those guys?
Well, actually, Lakeside, two of the Beavers brothers, Norman and Vincent, I knew because they lived right down the street from me.
No way.
And now also, they were just called Lakeside back in that day. I mean, excuse me, maybe it was Lakeside Express. It was one of them that when they went to L.A., they changed their name. They either dropped or they added. I think so. Maybe it was Lakeside Express, and then they changed it just to Lakeside. But Norman stayed in the group, but Vincent went out there, and he just didn't like L.A. So he came back, and they got another brother from Dayton to play bass. But yeah, I mean, we were all sort of running around at the same time, and I was kind of angry at my mother because when I did fairly well in high school and received some scholarship offers, and the fact that I went up to all Catholic schools, basically the quality of my education was pretty top notch. When I received 3 or 4 different scholarships and also was accepted to the University of Notre Dame in South Bend, my mother kind of forced me to do that. And I was a little angry because it was taking me out of the Dayton music scene right when things were starting to pop. But now that I look back on it, it was a blessing because what it did, it enabled me not to solely depend on music for my income.
Right. Well, yeah.
And there's a lot of musicians, huh?
I was going to say, having that other skill set, unlike the other musicians who just kind of honed in on the music aspect, the performance aspect, there's a balance to it. And it's really hard to engage the business end of it unless you get that knowledge.
But, of course, I had no idea of that at the time.
Right.
And, it's just like little kids, if you want to be a basketball player, you're really thinking just about the art and the physicality of basketball. You're not thinking about the business of having an agent and negotiating a contract and realizing that only, 30 players are picked a year to get into the NBA and actually stay. And then your career, if you're physically blessed, might last 12 years, and then you're in your 30s and you still have your whole life ahead of you. So what happened was, going to Notre Dame, I realized that I didn't want to do anything that would completely squash my music, and then I didn't want to do anything that would be useless once I graduated. So I decided to become a business major and actually graduated with a business management degree, which has been invaluable to me throughout my life, and the fact that I've handled the business from basically every band I've been in.
Which makes you an invaluable part of that band. Like, the band can't exist unless you're. So you're back to kind of being that. It's almost in a weird way where the bass is in the band, right? It's
Yep.
bringing the business end and the art end to it, and making sure it's capable and financially able to take that offer or not take that offer. It's an
Yep.
interesting
And also to know what
parallel.
that offer is from the top dollar.
Right.
Because, in the music business, I mean, just even the way it started, there have always been sort of folks who have taken advantage of musicians. And I saw that firsthand, even when I was just being a side person for other artists, in the fact that there's the booking agent, there's the manager, there are a lot of people that had their fingers in the artist's pies before the artist even was able to sit down at the table. So with me having the knowledge that I have, I basically eliminate both of those jobs. So I basically negotiate directly with the presenter or the club owner or whoever. So I know the top dollar. I know exactly what we're getting. It's not like I'm in the dark. And I've seen a lot of musicians be left in the dark, and the manager says, well, we can only pay you $500 for this gig. And then you look at the contract, or maybe finally he looks at the contract later and sees the gig was for $5,000. That happened very often.
Yeah. That just knowing that it could be, you know what I mean, having that insight like that, cuz if you're performing, you're already like there's so much that goes into that aspect of it. Then to try to dive into contracts and stuff and try to figure that out, I can see how that would, how that's overbearing for
Yep.
someone who's trying to front all that, and like, and if depending on the character, how hard that might be for someone to think critically like that when you're performing and in that mindset. So to have that insight like that especially at that time, like, because I feel now a little bit more probably than back then. Like a lot of groups are kind of handling a lot of like management and like booking on their own now, a little bit more than maybe when you had to depend on a record contract. But even dealing with something like that, though, I imagine there's a lot of like shiftiness and what actually is this contract and is this worth it. So
Yeah.
that sounds like you definitely lucked out with that.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, and I forgot the third element to that finger in the pie, and
Yeah.
those are lawyers.
Hmm.
So you have agents, you have managers, you have lawyers, everybody, publishers, everybody getting their finger in your pie for something that you create. None of
Right.
them have a job without the artist.
Right.
And the thing is, Dave, if but it's just maybe it's just human nature. I'm not sure, but if people had just dealt fairly with people, then maybe we wouldn't have all these cases of musicians ending up in poverty, although they sold hundreds and thousands of records and have gold records and platinum records on their wall, yet they're living at home with their mother. It can make you cry, man, when you think about just how musicians who are basically the lifeline have been mistreated.
Think about guys like Sly from Sly and the Family Stone, and like Hendrix and guys like that got completely run over with their contracts.
Oh, you can think about all kinds of folks.
Yeah.
You know, there's all kinds of folks. And the thing is, it's not even a racial thing. It's basically happened to everybody.
Right.
Everybody who didn't handle their own business basically has horror stories to tell about the business.
Do you think that is a kind of a because of the performer having so much else to kind of deal with, or do you think it's just the like the greed from the business end of it? Where's this
I
kind of
I think they leaned on that.
yeah?
I think they leaned on that and the fact that, look, you just take care of the music. Let me handle the business.
Right. Because that sounds
I
good.
think they leaned on that.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's exactly what you want to hear.
Right. Right.
And if those are like clubs that they created, music basically is a very organic thing. It comes out of a person, and it's either you do something that you perform or create something musically that resonates with other people, so it becomes popular, or you don't. But there's a lot of musicians who basically create music, and it pretty much is just a personal statement and brings like sort of like a personal gratification to them. Doesn't even become part of the business. But once you create something that resonates with other folks, be you sitting on your porch, and you play a banjo tune, and some folks says, that's pretty good. Why don't you come down to my general store on Saturdays and play? And then you play, and then all of a sudden you start to draw crowds, and then all of a sudden somebody says like, well, look, I can take you in, and we can make a record of this, and take you from being local to regional to national. You know what I
Yeah.
mean? You
Yeah.
just
Yeah.
you go along with that flow, and then before you know it, now you're touring the country, but you don't have any paperwork. You don't know what's going on with those records. You're famous, but you might be making a little bit of money on the road, but you don't know what's happening with the receipts, with the money coming in from those records and things like that. And then there you are. You're like, you're Johnny Cash, and you're really famous, or you're Buddy Holly and you're really famous, or you're Marshall Crenshaw and you're really famous, and then all of a sudden it's like, well, hold it. You're telling me I don't own my own music?
Right. You're too busy like performing it, keeping that thing going. It definitely. Um. Kind of on a side question. Growing up in the Dayton funk scene and starting to play bass, even though that's where you moved out before the big boom was. What bass wise? What was the lessons like that? Like just even hanging around, going from den to den, like just being with these other bass players. When did the thumb move around, or did the thumb stick? Were you that guy that inspired other friends to use their thumb? Like what like musically? What was like the lessons you took from the Dayton funk scene?
Well, really, Dayton Dayton funk is more than just music. I mean, it's also roller skating and dancing, and both of those sort of inform my music, especially roller skating. Because roller skating, there's like a Dayton, Ohio style of roller skating that's almost like, what's the yoga position where you basically balance one leg behind the other?
I can see it,
Is
but
it
I don't know the name of it.
is it downward dog or so whatever? But you know what I'm talking
Yeah,
about,
yeah, yeah.
right? Well, that pretty much is the position of the Dayton glide, but just with alternating your legs like that on skates to the beat, and then doing that and adding whatever personal flavor you have in that. So maybe you might step a leg back and hold it for like 4 beats, or you might hold it for 8 beats before you switch to the other leg, or you might turn it around so that you're doing that backwards, or you might wiggle your leg while it's behind you. Things of that nature. All that came into personal style. Well, when you're into that, basically it leads to your breathing being affected, because you breathe to the physicality of how you skate, and as I'm sure you know, breathing is very important in playing music, because what folks will tell you, and what you'll learn eventually, is that when you're young and you play what you consider to be a difficult piece of music or a difficult section of a song, if you pay attention to your physicality, you realize sometimes you stop breathing, which is just exactly the opposite of what you should do, because you should breathe through the section so that your body stays loose and nimble, and you're feeding it oxygen so that it can execute the idea. So once you get into the fact that how important your breathing is, like you should breathe more, you should feed your body more oxygen for the difficult sections of the music, then how you breathe sometimes will influence, how you play. And so the breathing that I had to put into effect, well, the breathing that I didn't have, the breathing that was in effect when I roller skated informed my bass playing. And so my bass playing basically, it's not so much on the beat as it's between the beat. And so that's another Dayton influence that really had nothing to do with musical instruction, but had more to do with environment that actually informs my playing. And I pretty much stayed with the thumb. I never switched to fingers. So there wasn't really much that I could share or take from other players, because most players play with their first two fingers. But what I could take was we could just all take just the whole sound of listening to each other. And of course, back in those days, you emulated, the recording artists that you were listening to. So we were listening to, everybody. We were listening to Hendrix. We were listening to Chicago. We were listening to the Beatles and the Stones, the whole British invasion, Steve Miller, the whole San Francisco scene. We listened to it all, and so we would play it all, and eventually we would play tunes, and then just sort of like morph them into as if they were our tunes. And sort of like a pivotal moment in my upbringing is, of course, as a bass player, the way you develop and gather technique is you put on records and then you try to play that bass part. And at one point I was doing that, and my father came in and said, "What are you doing?" I said, "Well, I'm learning this bass part." And he said to me, "Do you know what you're doing really is that you're just making that bass player famous. If you go out and you play that line just as is, then you're basically just making the bass player who's on that record famous. Doesn't do anything for you." And I thought about that and realized he was right. And so what I would do from then on is I would learn the bass part on the record, but then I would take the basic construction of that and think of how I would like it to sound, how I would play it. And so that was very instrumental to me, that moment. As it started, it helped me to develop my sound.
That's very well said and profound. It makes me think. There's this Mary Oliver quote about emotional freedom coming from the discipline and the diligent. So learning from others and learning how to make it your own. But even to combine it with just the natural movement of skating and the music, where it's going to end up to some degree, and being like feeling the physicality of that, that's really profound. I had an interesting experience earlier this week with one of my students, and I never thought of it this way. But what you said is making me think of it. Even like breathing is so important to music, and even on an instrument that you may not think a woodwind, that involves breath, but an instrument that doesn't involve breath, like drums, like even the drum shells we were using, like my class were passing around basically a drum kit broken up, and the one student was putting his finger over the hole on the side, and like, "Why is this here?" I'm like, and I just said, "That's so the drum can breathe," and I never thought of it like that until I said it at that moment. I'm like, "Whoa, it's very," because it is, when you hit it, the air's moving out. Even in
That's
an
right.
instrument that doesn't have like a direct contact with your breath is still in contact with your breath. It's a
That's right.
Yeah, it's so what you said was very profound. That's awesome. So when did the human switchboard become the outlet?
So after I graduated from Notre Dame, I auditioned because I wanted. Then I realized realized I really wanted to start to um, really start to refine my musical abilities. And through the professor who ran the jazz department at Notre Dame, he encouraged me, Father Wiskerchen, who basically at his high school in Chicago, he actually had two members of the horn section of Chicago were in his class. And when he came to Notre Dame to start their jazz department, he was the first one to introduce me to Electric Miles. I didn't know about Miles as far as his jazz and, well, not all of it was jazz, but his classical period of like Kind of Blue and Sketches of Spain and all that. I didn't know about Miles then. What introduced me to Miles was, Get Up and Bitches Brew and Jack Johnson and all that. So that's the Miles that I was first introduced to. And we would, I even remember the name of the little combo that we had there. It was called Erg's Finger Circus. And we were blessed to basically have 2 concerts a month at the Student Center. And then also I was able to continue my reading there in the Notre Dame Big Band. So he encouraged me to apply, and I applied to 3 or 4 schools. And I was accepted to Tulane University in New Orleans, and I was accepted to Berkeley and New England Conservatory in Boston. And I chose New England because it seemed like they had more of a individually focused curriculum, whereas Berkeley seemed to be a little bit more cookie cutter to me. And Tulane, I had never been down south. So New Orleans would just have been a completely new experience, and I sort of didn't want to, have put that much on my plate at that time. Right. So I went to New England, went there for 2 years, and then after 2 years figured I had what I needed and left and was in a band there by the name of Hypertension. And we became a pretty popular funk band in Boston from like 70, I want to say 78, maybe 76, 76 to 80. And then they kicked me out the band once we had we received a production deal from a gentleman by the name of Lyman Underwood, who was part of the Underwood Devil's Ham family. So he was wealthy, to say the least. And we went from playing on stage in our street clothes and riding in the back of the truck to basically being riding in limos, having 7 changes of handmade outfits and a rehearsal complex and the whole 9. And there was always a little tension in the band, and I guess the 2 older members of the band just decided that now that they were on the gravy train, they didn't really need me as far as business. And so they kicked me out, and in 1980 I came back to Dayton. While in Dayton, I was able to run into a guy by the name of Dean Hummons, who was in the bands Sun and Dayton, had hits, and he had like a 4-track recording studio in his basement. And I guess he got wind of a Sony Records contest that asked for a 4-song submission, in the effect that you might receive a recording contract. And he invited me and a few others. It was myself, this woman, Jenny Douglas, who now is one of the backup singers for Pink, has been for years. Roger Parker, who was one of the, he was, when Steve Arrington moved off the drums and moved to lead vocals in Slave, Roger came in to play drums for them. And then when Steve Arrington left Slave and started his own band, Hall of Fame, Roger Parker was the drummer in that. So he was the drummer. It was Dean on keyboards. It was Chris Bowman on guitar, who also played in Dayton, and now he plays with the Ohio Players. And we did a four-track. I mean, we did a four-tune, a collection of four tunes that we all wrote, and we didn't win anything. but
a lineup.
But
man.
what? Oh yeah, and in fact, just to tie that off, about 3 years ago, I was contacted by a label in San Francisco by the name of Beat Electric,
Yeah.
and they're basically part of a club of record collectors and also record label. They record collect, but they also produce. They also have their own labels. And he wanted to put out two of the tunes from that collection of songs.
That's cool.
And so he did, and they became a 12-inch, and they did very, very well. And so it's funny how it took, what is that, like 40, what is that? That's like 40 years, 50 years, 40 years later that what we did just to try to get a record contract, actually the tunes did come out on record. So I say all that to say, knowing Dean at that time, Human Switchboard was coming down from Cleveland playing shows in Dayton. The Walnut Hills and the, I think it was the 1080 Club or the 808 Club. And one time they came down, and because they were in the studio with Dean. I guess Drac from Slave had gotten up on stage with them and jammed, and they liked it. And Drac introduced them to Dean, and so they were coming to Dayton to record in Dean's studio. And they had a gig at the Walnut Hills, and the bass player didn't want to come down from Cleveland. So Dean, he recommended me. And both of us, Dean and myself, we learned about 8 or 9 songs, and then we did the show. And the show went really, really well till where just a few weeks later I received a call from Bob Pfeiffer and Myrna Makarian, and they said, would you like to join the band? And so I said, sure, because I wasn't doing anything else. So I would come up from Dayton to Cleveland. We'd rehearse for a few weeks, and then we'd head up to the East Coast and do the circuit at that time, which was like, what was it, CBGB's, Danceteria, Peppermint Lounge, Maxwell's in Hoboken, 930 Club in D.C., Khyber Pass in Philly, Storyville and the Rat in Boston. We'd come up and do a whole like little, run of the East Coast, and then take East Coast money back to Ohio and live comfortably for like, 4 or 5 months and then do another run. Well, things went so well with that to the point where now we were like one of the New Year's Eve bands, which back in those days was a big thing if a club would, invite you to play on New Year's Eve. So we would do Maxwell's, we would do CBGB's on New Year's Eve. We did really well. And then that started to garner record label attention. And we started doing demos for record labels. Did one for Capitol and Mike Thorne right off his, and he was hot because he had just, he was glowing, he was basking in the glow of Soft Cell's Tainted Love. And we were his next project. And then, and that fell through for a number of reasons. But and then we became the darlings of a man by the name of John Staines, who was working at Polydor, and Polydor was doing really well because they had Dexy's Midnight Runners and a few Big Country and a few other bands. So they were almost like a label that was looked at like bringing in the new hit makers, and John Staines wanted us to sort of like be next in line. So we would actually go into CBGB, like even when we did, and I'm flirting around a little bit, but it's all the same subject. Even when we did like the Capitol thing, demos, they basically brought us up, and I think it was Media Sound, the studio we worked at. They had an apartment on, I think it's like 66 off Broadway and between Broadway and West End. And Dave, I have to tell you, that was the very, very first time that, we sort of drove in, because everybody drove back in those days. And being at a 9-10 hour trip, we went to bed in the early evening. And I woke up 3 in the morning. So I heard like chatter on the street and car horns and everything. To look out the window to realize that there were more people on the street probably at that time of day and stores open than I had ever seen before. So me and the drummer Ron Metz, we got dressed and went out, and that's when we kind of fell in love with New York for real. Because here it is, 2 in the morning, and we could go places, we could get anything to eat and drink, and there'd be people out. And being from Ohio, where everything shuts down at 9 o'clock at the latest, that was just a revelation to us.
It is big. It's a big difference. It's a big difference. 9 o'clock set is, in Ohio is pretty good, but in New York, it's not the best time to start playing.
Yes, true. So that's how I got into Human Switchboard, and then they finally the record interest became so intense that they moved up from Cleveland. Bob and Myrna did, and then Ron and myself, we followed like a few months later, and we became a local New York band.
Who were you playing with Human Switchboard at that time? Like, who is the other local New York acts you were with?
Oh, I mean, you know what, the Flesh Tones and, oh, man. Richard Hell.
Okay.
The Individuals, the Bongos.
Nice. Yeah, Hoboken.
All the Hoboken bands. The Hoboken scene was starting to really pop then. Cynthia Slay. I'm trying to remember the name of her band. Bush Tetras.
Yeah.
Them and anybody who was sort of like vibrant in those days that was attractive to like Danceteria or the Peppermint Lounge, because we'd be on 3 or especially CBGBs, we'd be on 3 or 4 band bills and stuff. So I'd have to actually go back and pull out the club advertisements to tell you exactly. But anybody who was anybody back then, if they played those clubs, we played with them.
That'd be like coming from like, it makes sense that the influence of the radio you listen to, because like coming from a funk scene where it's all based on kind of like a roller skating and dancing, to maybe some of those acts are quite different. Like I'm trying to think of like the Contortions or something like that. That'd be around CBGBs or Perubu maybe coming up from Cleveland. You got some strange like not as like organized in a way, you know what I mean? Like jumping from like music scene to music scene had to be pretty enlightening.
Yeah, but I mean, Dave, even though we were in a funk scene, like I mentioned, the rock was just as prevalent. Because I mean, the McCoys come from Dayton.
Yeah.
It was we were just as into rock as we were as into funk. We were just, and in those days, and like I said, because of AM radio, basically just playing everything. We never really thought of things as being formatted, because it wasn't part of our upbringing. And so when you think of that, Hang On Sloopy and things of that nature were just as popular to us as anything. So the rock thing was just as much a part of me as the funk thing. So and all of it pretty much comes from R&B.
Right.
So with that as your basis, there was a common language that even when I was playing with rock bands, there was a common language that I could exude as the bassist, even though it was in a straight up independent rock context, no funk at all.
Yeah.
And so, but that's also probably particular to the instrument I played. Now, it might not have translated as well, say, if I was a guitarist or a keyboardist, or a drummer, because there are particular, idiosyncrasies to rock drumming and to funk drumming that really don't necessarily mix or don't necessarily meet. But bass playing, being a bassist, there's certain things that you listen to some of that the rock of those days, or you listen to like what's my man out of Detroit, who was big back then, major label, Bob Seger. Like that old fashioned rock and roll. There's some R&B in that.
Definitely. Well, yeah, that's interesting. I never thought of it like that because they are like, as far as like guitar wise, there are definitely opportunities in rock music that may not exist in like a funk tune or vice versa, or just kind of bits you have to make sure are there to kind of give the illusion of that genre. I find it fascinating. I like the idea of being like water, being able to fit into whatever music you surround yourself with. So after that, you did the JJ Jumpers, which was your first solo. Was it project, right, or was it not the case, and that was just the next group?
No, that was my first personal group.
Okay.
After Huma's Switchboard dissolved, I was up there, and not only did it was weird because, first of all, Switchboard dissolved because the two leaders of the band, the band had been together 4 years before I joined.
Okay.
And then I joined for the last 4 years. And it was during that time, the last 2 years, that really all the national recording activity was happening. And it dissolved because one of the leaders decided that if they signed the contract, they would have to be legally, contractually connected to that other person for the next 6 years. And they couldn't do it.
Jeez.
They couldn't do it. They just personally, so much had happened that basically that one person could not sign with knowing that they'd have to be interacting with the other person. So the band dissolved just like that. And we were all up here and just kind of like, left without a lifeboat, a life preserver. Now, what happened from that, though, the fallout from that was Bob Pfeiffer, he was offered a contract with Passport Records. And he called Ron and myself in with some other players, Bernie Worrell and some other players. We recorded. Yeah.
Nice.
Oh,
Wow.
Bernie would play with Switchboard when we would come to New York because they both had the same lawyer.
Yeah.
And Bob and Myrna met Bernie actually in the lawyer's lobby.
No way. That's so cool.
And yeah, Bernie would sit in with us and stuff. So I got to know Bernie. Like, my band JJ Jumpers actually supported Bernie on a tour for his volunteer slavery record because of that, the fact that we knew each other from those days.
Wow.
So, but not to get too far ahead of the story. So Bob received a record contract with Passport Records, and he recorded a solo record called Afterwards. And back in those days, the big thing was if you were an artist of note, you would host MTV's 120 Minutes. And, talk about, you'd be able to curate whatever videos you wanted for that program, and also talk about your recording. And Bob was of that nature, of that ilk, that he was able to do that. And so we were getting ready we were in rehearsals and getting ready to go out on tour in 2 weeks, national tour, and Bob gave me a call, invited me to lunch. And at lunch, he basically told me, and this is pretty much verbatim, because some things, Dave, you just don't forget.
Right.
He says, like, Jared, we can go out here, do this tour, and it could be really successful and sell a lot of records, and I can come home and still be broke after paying you and the band and road expenses and everything of that nature. And not only be broke, but being hocked to the record label for the tour expenses and all that. But I've just been offered a job as an A&R person with Warner Brothers. And at this point in my career, just looking as to what it could be and might be, I think I'm going to have to take this job. And he did. He took the job as an A&R person for Warner Brothers. And basically, once again, I was thrown out adrift.
Yeah.
But he could not, he could not have taken that job. He could not have said no.
Yeah.
It was just, it was just circumstance. And so after that, thanks to my business degree, I was able to acquire a job as the receptionist for a graphic arts firm called Coppell and Share. And they were pretty famous, both of those, both Terry Coppell and Paula Scher in their own right. Paula Scher, I believe, designed the famous Elvis Costello poster for Truth. And Terry was just he had worked for the Boston Globe Sunday magazine and just was really, really good at constructing, magazines and things of that nature, the graphic layout for those. And the two of them had gotten to know each other and liked each other and decided to open up their own company. And in fact, one of their first main employers was Swatch watches. And those first ads where you see like the watch and people skiing and stuff of that nature, that was Coppell and Share that did those and stuff. And so I was paid a pretty penny for that job. And from that job, I had enough money now that I decided to start my own band. And that's how JJ Jumpers came to fruition.
Okay, cool. And then going through that, that's where you crossed paths with Bernie, and then right? Or how long?
Well, I had known Bernie from the Human Switchboard days.
Oh, that's right. Yeah. Okay, so through that, so when you're doing your solo act, or when JJ and the Jumpers is taking off, how long into that before Bernie hit you up? Or
we were probably together for the Jumpers was together for a few years before Bernie even came on the scene with us, asked us to be his backup band. And that was just for a tour. It wasn't like, we were his backup band forever. Because we actually were part of the Black Rock Coalition. And as I was their first director of operations, we worked all the time. We were pretty popular on our own right. And we played Central Park Summer Stage, and we toured around the country. Even went to Italy for a festival. Things went really well. And I'll just say, basically that band got to the point where, Dave, it's a very tough thing, and we sort of like touched on it earlier, the idea of being creative and also business oriented. It's a very tough thing when one person has to wear both of those hats.
Right.
Because what happens is they start to bleed, the two worlds start to bleed into each other. And, if you're paying for rehearsals and paying people to come to rehearsals and you're setting up gigs and all that, and then creatively, let's say people are late to rehearsals, or they come to rehearsals unprepared, or you rehearse stuff and then you play the gig, and there's certain mistakes made that you just, that really shouldn't be made. Now you say that there's mistakes made that shouldn't be made, but human nature, mistakes happen. And in music, the great thing about music is that what appears to be a mistake to you on the inside, to somebody on the outside, they're just taking it for what it is. It's not a mistake to them. So So it could be just really a lovely musical moment that wasn't meant to happen, but happened, and really would only happen in that particular time. But it takes a lot of perspective to see it like that. If you're doing all the business and everything, you don't necessarily have that perspective, and so you might get angry at somebody for making mistakes, or angry at somebody for being late, or something like that, and then it affects your relationship with them musically. And so that's what happened basically. Is it overwhelmed me having to do both, and I couldn't keep them separate. So basically, after a gig coming back from Philly, I just decided I couldn't do it any longer because I had put so much into the band, and I really didn't. Unjustly, I'll say this. Unjustly, I thought I wasn't getting the fair return for what I was providing for everybody. But really, when I look back on it, everybody was doing the best they could. But at that time, and so I stopped the band. I immediately squashed the band the next day, and I became a side person. And from that, I went out to, I started playing with Freddie Johnston, and was on his Can You Fly record. We started to tour. In the midst of, we did 2 9-month tours back to back. In the midst of the second 9-month tour, I received a call from a manager friend who asked me if I wanted to audition for The, and I didn't know who The was. So I said, let me check. And I checked them on YouTube and just, whatever I could find, and saw that they were an English band of some note, and were doing some nice things. And I said, yes, I'd like to. And to find out that when my audition day was set, it was 3 days before I'd get back to New York. So I had to pass, regretfully. But what happened was that weekend there was a snowstorm, and Matt Johnson couldn't fly out. So and since we were traveling by road, we came back, and then I was able to. He was willing to delay, since he was already delayed, missed his flight that Monday, and I came in and auditioned with D.C. Collard and Dave Palmer and Matt, and I got the gig. And then I went to playing with The, which put me on a completely different level of rock. Now with Freddie, we did well, and we would go out and tour like in 3 and 4 band bills with like Soul Asylum, The Chills. What was Evan Dando's band? I can't remember their name. But anyhow, we just the top of the alternative rock. We were out with them. We did a thing for the owner of MTV also owned VH1. And basically we did the very first, I think they called it Rock and Golf or something like that. And the 3 bands on that bill were the 3 bands he thought were going to be the next hit makers for the next decade. Those 3 bands were us, Freddie Johnston, Sheryl Crow, and Hootie and the Blowfish. So he was right, 2 out of 3. And even later with because of that, when Cheryl had all the success off her American Music Club record, she invited us out for 4 months to open up for her. And so, I was doing well with Freddie. But when I went to The, things like they flew us over to Linz, Austria to rehearse. We rehearsed like for a month in Linz, and then we did a lo-fi down low European tour. And then we came back and did an American tour to support the record Dusk. And about a year later, we ended up opening up for 4 months for Depeche Mode. And playing with them, that enabled me to do things like play Madison Square Garden 2 nights in a row, sold out, play the Toronto Sky Dome, play the Forum for a week in LA. Just the the tippy top of what rock and roll was supposed to be. I was exposed to when we opened up for Depeche Mode, and so my career as a side person actually really opened my eyes to just how lucrative the business of rock and roll was, and it's aided me to this day in my negotiations and everything, because I really know the value of music and I know the value of the dollar, and I really just don't accept anything unless it's really what it's supposed to be.
Two questions on that. One, that's a fantastic voyage, pun intended, I guess, to from one spot to the other. But in your from taking because thinking of how stressful that would be to run the business end of it and the artistic end of it, and just being in that room, bringing in the horn section. The trumpet guy didn't practice the sheet. They're messing up everything, and the whatever, I mean, to have that mindset and be like, I know we're paying him this to be here. I can see how frustrating it would be that focus on the music because you're looking at the big picture of everything. So is
Yeah.
that how you handled being able to do both by being that side person? Was it easier to hey, bring it up to someone else? Hey, the trumpet guy, just so you know, this is what's happening. He keeps missing all the notes. You know what I mean? Or not that missing notes matters in music, but yeah, just that kind of mindset. Was that your remedy to kind of hit that that side spot more with more intensity than trying to run the whole thing? Because I imagine from the sideline it'd be easier to kind of run the business as well as have artistic input.
Well, you see, I mean, the remedy was just to end the band, to end JJ Jumpers.
Right.
Once I ended it, then all that angst disappeared.
Okay.
And then I just went back to basically, now, being a side man, side woman, side person, that is not a bowl of cherries either, because it's a very weird thing. And I mean, and as a side person, I mean, I played with Charlie Musselwhite, played with played with Cattell Connect, played with Katie Curtis, played with Freedy, played with Wadada Leo Smith, played with Vernon Reed and DJ Logic. I played with a number of people. And the whole thing about being a side person is you sort of go back into being in the dark. Because when you're negotiating, first of all, you have to get used to the whole thing of auditioning again. And that can be very, very off-putting.
Yeah.
Because, you step into a room, or you step into a building, and there you are with 12 other bass players for the same gig. And you have 20 minutes or so to sort of make an impression, and then, it's next. And so that can be, nerve-wracking. And what you don't understand is that, and you kind of understand it later, but when you first get into that world, what you don't understand, a lot of times the person who's picked is not necessarily picked because of their musical prowess. A lot of times a person can be picked because first of all, for you to get invited, everybody there is a decent player. So, that's a given. But a lot of times a person could be picked because of the way they look. It could be their gender. It could be because maybe the leader feels a sort of an affinity with them as a person. And you start to realize that it's not even really that important how well you play, but it's important how well you play, but it might be more important if the band leader thinks that they'll have a good time with you on the road, that they think you'll be fun, that you'll be a low stress person, low management tour mate, and things of that nature. And so once you realize it sort of like frees you up to just go in and be yourself. Because a lot of people will like, especially it was so competitive back in those days. They would actually, go online and take a look at the artists and maybe come in dressed the way they saw the artist dressed
Yeah.
on YouTube or something, or if the artist was and I'm not making this up. If the artist was like British or the artist was from a particular country, they maybe come in and fake an accent.
Oh no.
Oh
Oh no.
so it got kind of crazy, but
Yeah.
I'm blessed that sort of my artistry and the fact that I'm pretty low maintenance and pretty chill. I was able to get a lot of gigs.
Well, at that, if you're working the road like that, it makes sense. You want to be with who you can handle. Um,
Yeah, yeah.
my other question on the statement before was with the value of the dollar and the value of music. You said you know the value of both. Is one more valuable? And what is the value of both? Like on a business end of it, because without as far as music business, there's no business without the music. So that
There you
has
go.
to be like the top tier.
So the music is invaluable.
Right.
The music is invaluable. There's actually whatever dollar amount, the highest dollar amount you can get for your music or for a music engagement, whatever, is still not enough.
Mhm.
The only thing you have to sort of like focus on is just making sure that there aren't too many fingers in that dollar amount. So
Yeah.
if the
Yeah.
actual gig is for 5,000, yet as a band you make 1,500, that's unacceptable.
Right.
That's unacceptable because then we're talking about $3,500 that are going to folks who are literally riding on your back. So that's when you talked about how I'll go back about an hour ago in our conversation or 40 minutes ago and say that when you mentioned that it seems like folks today were more adept at basically handling business and music. Well, that's because the music industry crumbled.
Mm.
They were forced to.
Right.
So, it's just like, if you're forced into something, you don't really look at what it used to be. As far as a new player,
Right.
if you're coming up and you're a new player, you look at what your landscape is. You don't really even have the perspective to remember that there were gatekeepers back through the 50s and the 70s. And as a gatekeeper, you had to like basically you were able to refine your craft in sort of like a local market, and then from a local market you maybe did some regional stuff, and then from some regional stuff you maybe started to do some stuff in your part of the country, and then if you're lucky enough you get connected to a national representative that basically decides that they want to put the money in to putting your picture and your sound out around the world, and you become a national act. Well, there's gatekeepers all along the way to get there,
Right.
and you had to jump over these hurdles to get there, and a lot of acts didn't. Whereas Dave, now there's no gatekeepers.
Mm.
You and me, we could put together a band tomorrow and put it up on YouTube, and we're in the game.
Right. Right. Well, let's do it. um. Yeah. Well. So that also like, do you think that? I personally think that one, that's amazing that that option's available, right? That you can do that, and that those gatekeepers aren't there. But do you think so? I imagine that leads to a lot of unrefined kind of works being thrown at that market. Maybe they're not ready for um, to some degree, and also I imagine it makes it a lot now. Instead of just one signal, there's a bunch of signals which make like a static sound as opposed to here's an act. You know what I mean? Like
I do know what you mean.
Because I imagine there'd be a lot. Is that? I mean, is that the case? You think?
I think that is the case, and it's not even a good or bad thing. It's just the case as to what is. Um, First of all, when I was growing up, music had a particular emphasis in everybody's life that it no longer holds and hasn't held for maybe the last 20 years because, just the whole DVD and home entertainment and everything else with films and things of that nature has lessened the focus on music. And then the fact that there aren't any gatekeepers, the fact that everyone and anyone can create music. First of all, that is a lovely thing. But what it also does is there's so much music to sort through. How do you actually garner some attention?
Right.
To how do you make a livelihood out of having to be competitive with pretty much the world that is completely wide open to anybody to enter the game. And then the other thing I'll say about that, the one thing about having to jump the hurdles from the gatekeepers is that it forced you to refine your craft. It forced you to play, the chicken circuit and night after night. And like, well, just think about the Beatles in Germany and the fact that they had to play, 4 sets a night for however long. And then when you see them and you see like video footage of like the Shea Stadium concert, where basically they were piping the music through the audio system for the game announcers. The stadium was like packed with girls screaming at the top of their lungs. Yet the audio renditions that what you can hear, they were tight as a button.
Right. Right.
And they could only have been that tight because of all the time they put in getting to that point. So that's the lovely thing that was the one lovely thing about the gatekeepers, is that basically by the time you did become national, if you were blessed to become national, you were really good at whatever you did. Whatever your music style was, you were really good. And now there's not that support system. There's nowhere for bands to really develop their craft out of the national, international spotlight. And when I talk to musicians, as far as the landscape today, I tell them, be very, very careful, because if you want to really control your image, if you think about it, if you want to really control your image, you basically shouldn't even put anything out or play any place until you are completely developed and comfortable in your musical presentation. Because you could have, like, you can't even have warm-up gigs anymore.
Right.
Because somebody will be there with a camera phone and shoot it and put it up on YouTube.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, really, if you think about controlling your image, you don't even want to do any warm-up gigs or even play out until everything is completely the way you want it to be seen to the public, because at the very first time you play out, you at that point you lose control of it.
Mm. Yeah.
And if it's not a great show, or if it's then all of a sudden it's out there and people say, it's not a great show.
Right.
And they move on.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that definitely is a factor to consider. Like I never thought of it like that, because you're right. You can't even go out and try new stuff until it's perfected, because as soon as you do, and even even the person sharing the thing, it's probably with well intent. They're like, I'm supporting my friends. I'll put them up on a thing. But it's like you said, it becomes a public domain or not. It comes out to the public at that point, and then
Yep.
you can't be that well crafted image of
Now, the other thought on that, though, is that you really didn't just have to have a devil may care attitude.
right.
And you just go out and do it, and you don't even really care. I'm just talking about, there are certain people, you could see certain artists where when you became aware of them, they had a stagecraft down. They
Yeah.
had, you know what I mean? They had
Yeah.
a show, they had a look, they had a sound. And a lot of times, those are acts that basically had to jump hurdles and went through the whole music business process. And even if the promotional story fabricated about them said like, oh well, yeah, we saw these guys playing out on the sidewalk, and we said like, damn, that's a great sound. Excuse my
Yeah.
language. We
You're
said
good.
that's a great sound. Let's see what we can do with them. And then you find out that they had been together in like Little Rock, Arkansas for 5 years.
Well, it's definitely the deception too that sells the narrative. But like,
Oh, there it is.
right. So
There it
wow.
is.
And like, okay, what was like the biggest? I guess, I mean, this is a question down the rabbit hole, I guess, but biggest business revelation that you've gotten from schooling that stuck with you all the way through until now, even, that like made the music business make sense? Was there like a core principle that you found it fit in like any area it needed to fit? I know that's kind of a weird, vague question. Or is there any business philosophical approach which I know business and philosophy don't really go together, or maybe a logical approach I'm looking to say fits the narrative for no matter what?
Well, I'd have to say the the biggest revelation that basically has become a foundation of my performing and management style is there are no rules. Nothing's set in stone. If somebody tells you this is the only way that it could be done, a lot of times that's just to their benefit. Might not necessarily be to your benefit. But if you're strong in yourself, and see, that's the other thing, that's the other blessing in the fact that I did have uh, another financial outlet, that I could say no to some things musically if they really weren't going in the direction or compensated me to what I thought would be fair. I could just say no. A lot of musicians, or even whatever particular, like if you're a basketball player, a football player, a lot of times you can't say no because that's the only thing you can do, or that's the only thing you focused your life on doing. And the only way you can succeed is to be in the game. If you're not in the game, you don't even have a chance. So you have to say yes. And they know that. They know that. That's the thing. You have to understand that everybody, not you
Yeah,
personally.
yeah, I know what
I
you
mean,
mean.
just people have to understand that it's all human nature, and you wouldn't expect someone across the negotiating table. You would hope, but you don't expect anyone to be just like completely fair and say something to you like, well, you know what? This is your music. This is your art. You've put a lot of work into this. I'm going to help you, but I only need to take, just, a small increment of the income because you really deserve most of it. That doesn't lead to folks having like, a home in the Hollywood Hills and being able to send all their children to private school and stuff like that. So people basically just for what they'll say self-preservation, but really there's some greed in there too. Basically have to sort of like take more than take more than what they really should, so they can like continue to either build or maintain their lifestyle. And if you agree to it, well, then fine. You agreed to it, you signed the piece of paper. So basically, my thought on that is that if somebody tells you, well, the typical phrase, well, this is a standard contract, that doesn't mean you have to sign it. That doesn't mean you have to agree to that. You say, well, you don't want the standard because basically you are the standard. I'm the standard. Let's make a contract that's specifically good for me. And when you tell people that, and let me tell you, that also can make you a very lonely person too, because when people realize that they can't take advantage of you, or you won't sort of like play along with the game that enriches them, then you stop getting those calls, because they can easily find somebody else who's talented or who they feel they can make some money off of, who will sign that contract.
That's very insightful, though. Because your financial situation only matters to you. That should be the standard for the contract. Would be who is it being offered to. That's really well said. As a musician trying to figure out the business end of things, I really I appreciate this insight beyond beyond what I can express. That's really insightful. So the orchestra. With the reason we're here to talk, your career has been so dense so let's get the orchestra. When did the concept? Okay, just even the word orchestra, I find that very profound in a way, as opposed to orchestra. Now, is that a Sun Ra influence? Tip of the hat there.
It is.
Okay.
It's Greg Tate came up with the name. Greg Tate, who's the founder of the band, he came up with the name.
Okay.
Burnt Sugar, the Orchestra Chamber, and the band started basically as an idea in his head, and then he decided he wanted to get together a group of musicians to see if how it would sound with actual air moving. And his thought was he was enamored with Lawrence D. Butch Morris's conduction system, which is a system of creating seemingly scripted music out of improvisation. And Butch, when he started off as a jazz trumpeter, a cornet. How would you say that? Cornetist?
Cornetist?
I think it's like a cousin of the trumpet.
Right.
So he started off as a wind player, let's put it that way.
Works.
And then he switched to conducting. And he, from the story that I've been relayed, he asked his conducting teacher if I wanted to stop right here on page 36 and just sort of like really, delve into these 8 bars of music, the motifs presented during these 8 bars of music. How do I do that? And his teacher told him, you can't do that, because basically everybody's taught to just read through the score. That's what they're taught.
Right.
And he says, well, I have to find a way to do that. And so he developed conduction. And basically, so then what he could do is he could freeze. So say there's like a 2-bar motif. He could freeze that motif on the page, and then he could, through hand and baton signals, start to expand that motif. Be it play it at a different tempo, move it harmonically, maybe from where it's rooted into maybe the 3rd or the 5th or the flat 7th or something. He could basically take the motif and break it in half and have one side of the orchestra play one half and the other side of the orchestra play the other half, and then have them pile on top of each other with their halves of the motif. Yeah. And then on a hand signal or baton signal, go back to the score and continue with the piece. So Greg became very enamored with that. but he wanted to bring it into a Miles Davis Bitches Brews context. So he basically got a number of electric and semi-acoustic players together in a rehearsal room, who he felt had strong individual, strong musical personalities, and directed us through some improvs with his hand signals as basically leading us to where to go. And he would depend on you as a player to feel comfortable in the fact that the only thing you had to play was what you knew. So if he asked, he could look at you and give you a signal, which is sort of like an open-handed moving out signal, which is like to solo. So you would start to solo, and then you would start. He would hear a certain motif, and he would give you like a large C, point at it, which means like to repeat that motif. And then you start to repeat that motif, and then he could build a piece with the other musicians around that repeated motif. And then you have a created piece of music. So we did that, and we had a great time. People like Vijay Iyer, Bruce Mack, Ronnie Drayton, Trevor Holder, Simi Stone, Michael Morgan Kraft. A lot of great players were in that room. We did 2 rehearsals, and then we took it to CBGB's Underground and had our first gig. Did 2 gigs, and then we went right to the studio, and he added some other players, Swiss Chris, and a few other players, and we recorded the first record, Blood on the Leaf, in 1999.
So going into it, because I've gone through the discography a few times before talking, with that. So when was that, like, through those 2 rehearsals? What was basically on that record? Was there a level of improv that was? Because at that point, it's a different environment, I'd imagine, studio-wise, for how you described how the band works, which is, man, the amount of attention to these, and like, I imagine, did he come up with these signals, or were they just kind of felt and you guys learned what they meant?
Oh no, he had distinct signals.
Okay.
And basically, he just conducted us in the studio, and then just ran a lot of tape, just like Miles would used to do.
Yeah.
Run a lot of tape, and then you go back and you cut and paste it together, or you find a particular section that you really like, so you just take that section and create a piece, and then call some people in for overdubs over that section, things like that.
Yeah.
But yeah, all that on the first record is pretty much conducted. And then there are overdubs of folks who came back in and recut stuff. It's completely unscripted, scripted music.
Right, which is, it's the way of no way. It's the like, it's
Yes.
That's amazing. Because like it takes the freedom of, like, you'd find in something like jazz, where like you're going off the charts, right? You're playing the standards, or you're doing the reharms of it, and then you get off the head, and you're just playing over the changes. It's like the changes now can change as you're playing over the changes, and like that's pretty profound to put it in that context of like the essence of like of a jazz band in like kind of a classical approach. Like,
yes. And Dave, I mean, what do we even call jazz? I mean, to me, jazz really isn't a music; it's a sensibility. Now, the fact that we have people like I think there's actually a sort of like an uproar from a few famous jazz musicians saying, like, let's just ban standards, let's just stop playing them, because basically the only thing they do is sort of proliferate the has-been. It's almost like the same thing that my father told me. You keep playing these standards, you're just making the folks who actually created them famous. It doesn't really do anything for you. Where's your music? Jazz was supposedly, at the time, always the cutting-edge music of its time. That stopped, 30 years ago? 40 years ago?
Yeah.
Ever since people started to, like, put a bad name on Fusion, because when Fusion first started, come on, Weather Report
Right.
and the first, you listen to that first record of Weather Report, or you listen to Herbie Hancock's Headhunters,
Right.
or that stuff is just miraculous. You listen to Herbie Hancock's when he had the Sextet
Yeah.
album, come on, that stuff is miraculous. But then all of a sudden, we got into this whole thing of well, and I have to tell you, we received a little kickback when we would go and do workshops at music schools and music departments. The first things that because the teachers would do is they wanted to try to expose us as basically the reason we're doing conduction is because we're uneducated. But so it's like, well, we would just want to read down this chart. And wonder if y'all would join us. And then, of course, we'd read down the chart right with them.
Right.
And so that threw that bone out the window. And then we could get down to what we were trying to expose them. And rather than the professors embracing us, basically what they do, they would feel threatened when they didn't see this as really being another tool to engage their students and to expand their creativity, which is all it is.
Yeah.
So, I mean, the whole publishing house thing, the whole BMI ASCAP, let's play Stella by Starlight for the 895th time.
Yeah.
Come on.
Yeah.
That's not jazz.
But in this sense, it is, because it's almost like taking the elements of just like nature in a way. You can't control what the water's doing, but you can control how you look at it. You can't control where the leaves and the trees are blowing, but you control your view of it as far as shifting where you're at, your viewpoint. And like that's what's so profound about the orchestra. No, I'm sorry.
Yeah, so that's what Butch basically is sort of like opened up a pathway for the thought of jazz to continue.
So it's about the current project you guys got coming out, the Wakanda. So that I found after listening through this project it seems like all the musicians are of a certain caliber, and I imagine just even looking at your career, everyone's career has to be pretty busy. Maybe now is a different time, so getting everyone in the same room, I imagine, is not easy. But like this record, it sounded like there was some more like electronic drums kind of going on with I think it was the second track. I don't know if when I got them and they're in the exact order of how it's supposed to come out when Howard sent me the advance. But
yeah, you're talking about Midnight Moors.
Yes. Yeah, because it had the cool descending bass line. And it was just like in the pocket of it. It's a cool track. But that sounded. Is that the kind of a new approach with this record? Is there like an overarching tale that's being woven?
There's an overarching tale to that, and basically, the first track, "Angels Over Wakanda," is from a recording session in 2018, and then that recording session, on February 29th of 2000 and. Do I want to say 19, maybe 2019, the Orchestra Chamber played the Apollo Theater, where we had a sold-out audience that viewed the film Shaft, and we played the soundtrack live.
I saw the YouTube video of that. That's cool.
Yeah, the producers of the show, Cami Music, basically were taking a chance with us because they had done, this kind of thing before, but they had been with classical orchestras where everything was charted and everything of that nature. And they didn't know, as the kind of ensemble we were, if we'd be able to have the
but it almost makes sense. Like if it's scored, it's like there's a confidence that what the orchestra is going to do is going to completely line with the film, and if it's more improv, it seems like that would be the fear. Like, wow, they're gonna They're not going to hit the beats. You know what I mean? Like I can see where
I
the
do, but see, what we did though is as we do, even though we're playing like the Isaac Hayes score, we actually, what we like to say is caramelize. We sort of like burnt sugared it,
yeah.
so that it's how we would play it. Now, what we had to do though, they weren't sure we'd be able to do the in and outs.
Oh, okay.
Because when you play to a film, you have to start the music at a particular time, and you have to be out because it's all sort of like intermixed with the dialogue and intermixed with particular whatever sort of like street sounds or
Yeah.
or the sound of a door shutting or something like you stop and then the door shuts, or you stop and then somebody starts to say something, or the scene switches. You have to be very precise in all that. And they didn't know if as an improvising band, if we could do that. And we did. We did. We hit all our P's and Q's, and the audience loved it. And when the owner of the presenting company came backstage, he was in shock because he thought something would go wrong, and nothing went wrong. And from that point on, we were looking at a East Coast, West Coast, and European tour that was probably going to make our earnings for the year somewhere in the six figures. The week after that, all of that was out the window because of the pandemic.
Right.
So we did two things, Greg and I. We had some money saved for our first vinyl release, and instead of using it for that, we immediately chopped it up into stimulus packages for the burnt sugar independent contractors who were most in need. Because, of course, after the 29th, the first day is rent day.
Right.
So we helped out a number of people like that. And then when we realized that the industry was going to be shut down for a long period of time, we started to look around at our back catalog and ran across that 2018 session and realized we had something there that we could actually go in the lab, so to speak, and work with. And so that's what we did. We took that and we remixed it. Then we sent it off to Berlin, where Satch Hoyt, who's plays flute, a flautist, he's an OG with us. He basically made 3 or 4 flute stems. Then we took it to V. Jeffrey Smith's studio, Jam Carver in Jersey City, and attached the flute stems and mixed a few other things in it. He did some horn parts. And then Greg decided he wanted to send it to Mark Gilmore in Stockholm, but didn't want to send the track. What we decided to send him was just send him all the didn't want to send the tune, Angels of Wakanda, just sent him the individual tracks. And without having, any kind of knowledge of the loop, which is the basis of Angels of Wakanda, everything's based off that loop, we're not having any knowledge of that. That's where he created Midnight Moors. He created, and not only did he create Midnight Moors, but he created a 45-minute suite that is comprised of 6 different songs, Midnight Moors being just one of them. And the loop doesn't appear in any of them. It's a completely different musical offshoot from the loop-based tunes. And so it gave us another two releases worth of material, and we picked Midnight Moors to be just a teaser of what's going to come next as part of the original package. And then we, to tie off Angels of Wakanda, we sent all the material to Isala Beatty, who's like an OG vocalist with us, probably one of the best vocalist we know. Anybody knows once you hear her. And she picked just a little segment of Midnight Moors, built a loop off of that segment, and Greg sent her some lyrics, and she created the solo over in Wakanda vocal track. She did all the different harmonies and everything. And then the last piece to the puzzle was Wakanda Overdrive. And basically that's my creation. What I did was I went in the studio with Jeff and took a segment that starts really about 10 minutes in, and just made the first section of it the actual acoustic drums from Greg Gonzalez, me on bass, and featured brought up Leon Grunbaum's Fender Rhodes part, and made that kind of the first section. And then about 3 minutes into Wakanda Overdrive, that's when I brought the loop in. Then what I did was I wrote a tenor and flute part for the first section, and then for the second section, I cut and pasted various segments from Satch's flute stems and cobbled that together, and then had Jeff double it on tenor to create the horn line that goes through the second section. So it's really totally a Frankenstein thing.
Yeah. Wow. Well, it seems kind of like the nature of the orchestra is that is just that. So that's beautiful that not only Greg, but all you guys can kind of contribute that way. And like, so once you wrap all that up, you send it to him, and does he shift it or kind of keep it how it is, or where does it go from that?
Well, the thing is what has happened over the years. You know, there were, when we were sort of like the new kids on the block back in the early '90s, we basically played every place just on the notoriety of being a conducted band that any show someone would see, they would basically only see that show there at that time, because no two shows were the same. Well, after a while, the other bands start doing that, and also you're not the new kid on the block. So we were blessed in the fact that the Apollo Theater, and we've had a long relationship with them and Laura Greer, their artistic director, they were having a tribute to James Brown, but they didn't want to hire a James Brown cover band. So they thought that it might be a cool idea to have us come in and play James Brown, but play it the way we would play James Brown. And it went over really, really well that day. That led to us through Lincoln Center and the Walker Arts Center in Minneapolis and the Hammer Theater in L.A. and Portland Jazz Festival, Earshot Jazz Festival, the there's a jazz festival in Sant'Anna Risi, Italy, Calgary, Italy. They all would ask us to basically caramelize a particular songbook, and so that sort of got us through the second third of our career, where we would go in and we would we would do a Rick James tribute, a Prince tribute, a We Insist Freedom Now, Abbey Lincoln, Max Roach. Oh, cool. So, and that became very lucrative for us. And then we decided with the pandemic pretty much shutting everything down, it was the perfect opportunity for us to go back in the lab and go back to our roots. So, it's like Angels of Wakanda could just as well have followed Blood on the Leaf and the trilogy we put after Blood on the Leaf. That depends on what you know, part 1, part 2, part 3, as far as being pretty much conducted improvisation, only this time with Angels, rather than just having one conductor, there's like 5 or 6 conductors, because we've all been immersed in the system so long, we all know it so well, and all the players know it so well that now it's become a family conducted ensemble.
In listening through the discography and getting to this one, it has, like how you're saying, it has that feel of those, but also it doesn't. It sticks out, which makes sense now that you describe how it was written, and then diving into your guys' live performances, that's a whole nother feel. Like, because I dove into that a little later after I went through the discography. I'm like, oh man, they're doing their own take on Max Roach. Like this is like I was saying, I'm halfway through that one. I was like, I started maybe at the wrong point. This is equally as cool, and just trying to figure out how all this works. I'm like, but hearing how that narrative came together, and that's a cool way that kind of goes back, really to kind of what your dad said, in the most like profound way, because you're paying homage to all these people that their music, but you're not doing it. You're not just making their legacy louder. You're starting your own, and
Yes.
that's amazing. That's how music should be. Like, we are only our own. The only one that can play your songs is you, and like we spend so much time reciting what other people say. I don't think we. Yeah, and I think maybe that falls into, especially now, like with rhetoric and just like lack thereof, like to get weird politically. But I feel like a lot of people don't think for themselves in a weird way, because we're spending too much time repeating people we think we should repeat, and then you don't really learn. And I think that's the same case musically, and like it's
Yep.
important to be your own voice musically and like thought provoked.
Well, what's funny about all that is that everybody's lives are so jam packed with just people trying to get through the day
Yeah.
that a lot of times they go for the easiest way, so they can sort of they just go for the easiest way.
Yeah.
And the easiest way is usually to follow the leader, and because it takes time. It takes time and a lot of concentrated effort to develop your own style, especially with all the noise that's in everybody's ears these days. It's not an easy thing, nor is it made easy for you.
Right.
There's no support system for that, and so that's what's kind of sad. But also it points out that I hope that you let your students know that they really, if they're going to spend a lot of time in this, that they owe it to themselves to develop their own style, so that they come out, so that, and by own style, it has to be the kind of thing where when somebody, complete stranger, hears something, they will investigate it because they don't know who it is.
Right.
And then they find out it's you. But
Yeah.
if it sounds like, Criss Cross, or if it sounds like, whoever, if it sounds like Amy Whitehouse or whatever, but that's the way the industry tries to do this. It's like, and they used to do that a lot. They used to say like, well, okay, this person is hot. Well, we need to have somebody like that on our label. And then an artist might be like, well, that's not really what I do. And it's just like, well, look, we'll sign you and we'll pay you and we'll put you out on the road. And you sort of say like, well, okay, maybe I'll do that just to start, but then I'd like to basically get back to my music. And then you become famous. And they're like, well, I'm sorry. We need another one of these.
Right.
We need another Amy Winehouse cover record. And you're like, well, but I have my own originals, and I thought maybe, and once I became famous, I said, well, you're not famous because of your own originals, because nobody knows your own originals. You're famous because you sound like Amy Winehouse.
Yeah.
So come on.
Yeah, it's a vicious circle, because like
It is.
it is like you want that in, and you think that would be your platform, because there's narrative like that, but like. But it's no, and I agree 100%. It's you define yourself and be confident and proud of yourself is worth more, I think, maybe. And if you can do it that way, and I think those artists tend to stick out for and make that they become the new Amy Winehouse in a way that the record
Yeah,
label is going to try to get. But it's hard to do that because you got to do everything on your own, and you would
yeah,
know, coming from both
yeah.
angles of it, how hard it is to push someone like that. But
But it makes it so much. It makes it so gratifying
right,
in
right,
the end. I mean, if the journey was easy, everyone would do it.
100%, yeah,
So yes, the journey's hard for you to develop your own style and for you to stick to that style and for you to and also to be comfortable in rejection. You have to be comfortable in the fact that there will be people who say no, but you have to understand that the same thing I was talking to you about being a side person when
right,
you don't get the gig. A lot of times it has nothing to do with your musicality, or it could be just the way the leader just doesn't feel comfortable with you, or feels more comfortable with someone else,
right,
but doesn't diminish your worth or your value. And so it's you have to have that sort of, what is that term, intestinal fortitude.
mm,
You have to
yeah,
really have that. You have to have that to be true. Now, it's not for everybody.
right,
And if you want to go the route of, if somebody's going to give you something if somebody's going to put you on Caribbean cruise tours for
yeah,
for 5 years to be a Bob Seger cover band, and you're going to get paid really well and be able to eat lobster and shrimp every night, go for it.
it's a comfortable gig, but you're living the what's that movie, Groundhog Day, over and over. I imagine a lot.
But some people, I mean, that would be success. I'm
Right,
sure there are some people
right,
who would consider, and you know what? It would be success.
yeah. You're making a
Because
living doing music.
I'm not
Yeah,
trying to belittle anybody's the path they get to where they want to get. I'm
right.
not trying to belittle that, but I'm just saying, make it self-determination. You determine where you want to go. That's all I'm saying.
Uh, Jared, I appreciate. I think that's the perfect point to leave off on. Like, there's no better end note on that. I really appreciate your time, man. We've been talking for a minute, and before talking, I dove into your career and just the history of everything, and this is the exact conversation I was looking to have. So thank you very much for spending time with me and talking with me.
Dave, my pleasure, man. Thank you.